how about a nice warm round of applause for my very brave wife, Alicia Dix.
Thank you, honey. The partnership that we have with Voices of Hope is truly one of my favorite things since starting Speak Up. It's one of the best things for me that's come out of that. I feel supremely passionately about the importance of these stories being told and being kept alive, and about the unique and essential perspective of the second generation. Knowing how the ripples and the horrors of the Holocaust continue to reverberate is so vital to understanding the complexity and lasting effects of what happened. Through doing these workshops and working with people and hearing their stories, I feel like when you try to, if someone says, tell us about the Holocaust, it is like staring into the sun, that it's too big to describe, to explain, but by hearing the people whose parents went through this and their experience, having grown up with those parents, breaks it down. And I think it's so important to relate to that, to continue to have these stories on such a personal level. This amazing group of people have truly been a pleasure to work with. They've worked really, really hard, and they've been really fun, and I'm excited for them to shine in front of you today. Our next storyteller is Ted Zablotsky. Ted lives in West Hartford with his wife Vivian, and they have 4 grown children who Ted describes as finally off the payroll. They have 1 grandchild who they're enjoying so much. Ted says they're encouraging their other children to create more of those. Ted is active in the community and is in his 2nd term as president of the Hebrew High School of New England. He's also on the board of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford. In what Ted refers to as the productive part of his life, he was a co-owner of a medical device firm that he founded with his brother. Ted says he enjoys an eclectic mix of musical styles and is very fond of his hot tub. You will not be shocked to learn that Ted chose as his favorite famous Jewish person, Mel Brooks. He told me that he admires his brilliance, his audacity, and his willingness to go there. He says, I can't tell you how many times I have heard him say something or seen something in one of his movies and remarked, only Mel Brooks. The man makes me laugh out loud, and that is a really good thing to do. I think we're all in agreement with you, Ted. Please welcome Ted Zablotsky.
Yeah, but there we go. I was stepping on the cord. That was the problem.
Oh, that was making noise.
Stand right up. Yeah. Does that look good?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sitting next to my dad in the first class section of an airplane. He's never been in first class before, but on this section of our flight, I thought that he could use a little extra comfort and a little pampering, and I flew a lot for business, so I used my miles to treat him. The reason we're on this flight is that my sister had been diagnosed with cancer in her uterus. My dad was from the time of life where he believed that in times of desperation, you say prayers at the graves of your ancestors. His ancestors were buried in Belarus, so we were flying to Vilna in Lithuania because that was the closest airport to the area we were going to. The flight attendant brings over our salads, and as she serves the salad, another flight attendant comes with a basket of warm dinner rolls. My dad's happy to take one of those. And about halfway through the salad, she comes around again and offers seconds, which he also is happy to take. When she comes around to clear the salad plates, he says, those were really great. Do you have any more of those? So she brought him yet another one. That's a lot of bread for my dad, even though he loves bread, but let him enjoy the perks of first class. A little while goes by, we're talking, and then they bring the entree. And they put the plate down in front of him, and he looks a little surprised. He looks at me, looks at the plate, he says, well, if I knew there was going to be more food, I wouldn't have filled up on bread. Well, that's my dad. So I was a little apprehensive about some of the details of the trip, because usually when I traveled, I took care of all the details. But my dad was going to take care of the hotel, the transportation, the local guides, everything. And that wasn't his strong point. I knew we were going to meet my brother, who was flying in from Florida, at the Vilna airport. The rest of it I wasn't sure about. But sure enough, there were people at the airport to meet us, and my brother was there. And we piled into the cars, and they took us over the border into Belarus. And after a while, we approached the town that my mom was from, Lida, which is a good-sized town. And I figured, great, we can get into the hotel and get some rest, but we keep driving. And we drive and we drive, and we leave the paved road and get to a dirt road, and in a little while we get to a village, or whatever's smaller than a village, and it's one lane with wooden houses on both sides. It turns out we're going to stop and see Stashik. Stashik was a name that I knew well. He was a non-Jew that had been friends with my dad all of his life and had saved my parents several times during the Holocaust. So we're going to stop and say hi. No problem, this is great. We pull up in front of one of these little wooden houses, and Stashik comes out to greet us. And if you were going to call Central Casting and ask for a little stooped over Russian peasant, it was Stashik. There's a picture of him in the back. And he and my dad embrace in a reunion that was so heartwarming. They hadn't seen each other in almost 50 years, but had been through some really, really intense times in their lives. We go into the house, and it's a one-room deal with a bed in one side. On the other side, there's a table with some chairs and a couple of couches and some other chairs. And the kitchen is a sink on the wall, but there's no plumbing in the house, so there's a bucket under the sink, and then there's a little appliance, a 2-burner stove. And my dad and Stashik start speaking to each other in Russian, and I'm surprised and really amazed that my dad can speak Russian so effortlessly. And he's not searching for words, they're just having this conversation, and they're catching up, and it's really, really very nice. My brother and I don't speak a word of Russian, and we're not involved in the conversation. There's no one translating for us. So we sit on the couches, and we're just kind of, okay, let them enjoy. After a while, the jet lag, the time changes, all this stuff, we're like nodding off a little bit on the couches. My dad must have noticed. He said, okay, it's time for bed. Great. Let's get to the hotel, take a shower, get some sleep. Turns out we're sleeping at Stashik's that night. Somehow we all found some place to sleep, and it's nighttime. Now, there was only one bare bulb in this whole room. The town had only been electrified a couple of years before. So at night, it's dark. It's really dark. And out of the darkness in the middle of the night, I hear my brother say, I've got to go to the bathroom. He's got 2 challenges with that. 1, there is no bathroom. And 2, even if there was, you couldn't find it because it's really black. Your eyes open or closed, it's the same. You don't see any different. Just then, we hear our dad coming back from outside. And he takes my brother by the hand and navigates his way out of this room, over a raised threshold, into the pitch black night. This is more than just amazing, because around the same time my sister got her diagnosis, my dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and it had spread to his leg, and he was using a cane for stability. Yet here he is gliding through the night, which is really impressive. And in fact, the whole trip, there was a part of my dad that seemed to have been energized, that he was able to do things that he hadn't been able to do in years, and had a vitality and an endurance that was really remarkable. Next morning, we get up and we start having breakfast. Everything was grown in Stashik's backyard, chicken, eggs, and potatoes, and cucumbers and tomatoes. And there on the table was this big pitcher of moonshine. Over the years, my dad and mom had put together a parcel for Stashik a couple times a year, when they would put clothing and some money and some whatevers and a 5-pound bag of sugar. Well, this is what the sugar was for. So we have this really nice, fresh breakfast and a couple of shots of moonshine each, and they're still chatting away, and my brother and I revert to form and decide to start ribbing my dad a little bit about one of the stories that he's told us over the years that we found particularly entertaining, when he would say, "I have land in Russia." And because we were such educated Americans who knew all the ins and outs of Soviet land trusts, I said, "Dad, no one owns land in the Soviet Union. It's all from the state. If you own land, show us a document. Give us, where's the title to this land of yours?" So we start bothering my father and said, "Listen, as long as we're here, can we see this estate of yours? And maybe because we're going to be inheriting this someday, we'd like to see it." And Stashik asks my dad to translate what we're saying, because he doesn't know what we're saying. Better he shouldn't have known. So he says, in a not really happy voice, "You slept last night in Stashik's house. You're having breakfast in Stashik's house. You ask anybody on this street, whose house is this? They'll say it's Stashik's. You ask anybody on this street, who owns the house at the crossroads? They'll say your father does. We know that because that's his house. His father built that house. My father built this house. I have no paperwork. He has no paperwork. It's his house." Well, sufficiently reprimanded, we shut up, and we go out. He says, "Let's go see this house." So we leave his home, and last night when we got here, it was getting dark, and I didn't notice any details, but it feels like I've been here before. There's some familiarity about this place. It turns out that when my second son was in 5th or 6th grade, I don't remember which, he had an assignment to do a project on the Holocaust, so he interviewed my mom. And my mom told him about the time when she was in the partisans with my dad, and one of her jobs, was to go out and get food. So she and another woman had come to the village and gone to Stashik's to see if he could help them. And while they were in there, a neighbor came and knocked on the door all in a panic and said that there was a German patrol at the end of the street. So Stashik took my mom and this other woman and put them in his barn and put a chain and a padlock on the door. So when the patrol came by, they said, "We're looking for a couple of Jewish women we heard were in the area. Open your barn, we want to take a look." He pointed to the chain on the door and said, "There's no way they could get in. There's no other entrance to the barn." So they left. He risked his life, literally, to save them. So my son had built this diorama with a little farmhouse with a well in the front yard and then a barn with a blue door. And that's where it happened. And I'm standing there next to a well outside of Stashik's house, and there's a barn with a blue door. It was really remarkable. We walk out, we go down the lane, and we go to my father's house. It's right where he said it was, right on the crossroads. No one lived there. The people in the town helped themselves to the apple trees and the sour cherry trees. In fact, the sour cherries was what made the moonshine taste so good. And again, we're sufficiently humbled now that all these things that we hear about are real. So now we're going to go and try and find the purpose of our visit, which are the graveyards of my ancestors. My dad's father passed away when my dad was only 11 years old. We knew, or he knew, that he had been buried in a Jewish cemetery outside of a small town nearby. So we went there first. Instead of finding a rows of headstones, there was an open pasture with a horse running around in it, and a plaster pillar with a sign attached to it that said this used to be a Jewish cemetery. That was it. But my dad said his prayers and asked for help for the recuperation of my sister, and then we went to try and find his mother's grave. Now, his mom had passed away in the Lida ghetto of starvation, so there was no Jewish burial grounds anymore in those days. They just put them somewhere, and with the help of a local guy, we found the place where these people were buried who died in the ghetto. It was behind a row of garages and storage sheds. The only marker was a pine tree that had a white styrofoam tray on it, the kind that you get if you bought a big pack of meat in the supermarket. And on this tray it had written, "Don't throw your trash, people are buried here." That was his mother's graveyard. And again, he said the prayers asking for help with my sister's recovery. My mom's parents were still in the ghetto when my parents escaped. They were there with their son, who was only 14 years old. After my dad joined the Partisans, he was able to find ways to move in and out of the ghetto, and did it regularly to try and help my mom's parents and bring them support, food, whatever he could. Because of his connections, he had heard that the Nazis were planning an action on the ghetto, which meant that they were going to liquidate the people in the ghetto. So he went in and talked to his father-in-law, my grandfather, and told him what he had heard, and said, "Let me help you escape into the woods. You can survive with us." My grandfather, despite everything he had seen since the days the Nazis first parachuted into that town, the daily murder and brutality in the ghetto and everything else, was convinced that there was no way the Nazis were capable of doing such a terrible thing. And what I've since learned has been a fairly common feeling, was that if we just do what they tell us, they'll leave us alone. They'll let us be. Obviously, it wasn't true. So my dad said, "Please at least let me take your son." He was only 14 years old, my uncle. And my grandfather said no. And a couple days later, the Nazis rounded up everyone in the ghetto and marched them to a field outside of town where a huge pit had been dug, and made them take off all of their clothes and put them into like piles and wait in line for their turn to be murdered. And it's always bewildered me to try and figure out how horrible my grandfather felt standing there waiting with his wife and his child, that he had an opportunity to perhaps be saved, and he didn't have it. He didn't take it. And there's just no way I can conceive of what that must have been like. And recently, in thinking about this story, it's occurred to me that as my brother and my father and I were standing at the site of this massacre with twin granite monuments that say in Russian and in Yiddish, on this site, on May 8th, 1943, the Nazis murdered 6,700 Jews. It's a number of such enormity that it's not real, except that some of those people were my grandparents and my uncle. And my dad must have known a lot more people, and what my dad must have been thinking about what could have been if they would have just listened to him. But there were so many times in my dad's life where he had to deal with things that I can't conceive of. He was the strongest man I ever knew, and he always did whatever he had to do to keep going, whether that was going to work at 11 years old to support his mom, or making a meal out of a salad and 3 dinner rolls, or dealing with the death of his daughter when she was only 40 years old. Thank you.